First, I want to give a warm thank you to any who have a desire to open a new door to old history. I'm excited to finally bring you the complete trilogy. It was 4 years in the making. As an author, through the grace of Allah, I saw a real need in the Ummah for a firmer foundation for our youth. Let me briefly tell you how these books came about. I worked as a secretary in an Islamic school, and I got a call to step into the principal's office. It seems that the major book supplier for the school had offered for the Islamic schools to put in a 30-page supplement to their history book. Since I had already researched and written 4 books, my principal said this was right up my alley. I accepted and ordered their latest history book. When it arrived, I flipped to the first chapter, and there were the Neanderthals, 30,000 BCE, which is where we would begin. But when I flipped to chapter 2, there were the Sumerians, big as life. They were 3,300 BCE. I wondered where the missing years between them had gone. What about Prophet Adam and his progeny, and all the prophets before 3,300 BCE? No, I called my principal and told her that I couldn't supplement shirk or gaps, and that I would write my own textbooks. I began with the Big Bang and ended with the Big Crunch. Volume 2 on the Islamic dynasties came about when I realized that many Muslims were only reading one or another of the dozen or so books that I used to write Volume 2. They were only getting one small piece of the pie. Volume 2 is also filled with historical fiction stories and a brief history of the time between Isa and our prophet, peace be upon him. There is a short section on our prophet, peace be upon him, and the 4 rightly guided caliphs, and then starts the history of 18 dynasties, beginning with the Umayyads of Syria and ending with the fall of the Ottomans. This melding of sources produces a fairly complete picture of the glory, accomplishments, and ups and downs of these leaders of the world. There is an amazing compare and contrast between the dark ages of Europe and the blazing light of the Abbasids, the Umayyads of Spain, and all the dynasties who contributed to the golden age of Islam. Volume 3 picks up with World War I and the Sykes-Picot Agreement and goes all the way to Paradise and Hellfire. It covers along the way 61 minor signs of the Day of Judgment with timelines from the 1900s to 2020 to show how they have already come. There are then poignant stories of how the 10 major signs might unfold. Volume 3 ends with a first-person account of illness, death, the grave, the Day of Judgment, Paradise and Hellfire, all sourced from the Quran and Hadith. I believe this knowledge is something we all need. Look, I think we can all agree that our Ummah is inundated with information and is trying to hold onto the hot coal of Islam against mounting odds. Self-esteem comes from knowing the history of where you come from and where you are going. I wrote these volumes to give the Ummah back their legacy, one of goodness, deep devotion, and Islamic leadership. Volume 1 is jam-packed with history, like a mosaic of the spread of Adam's children, from the area in Turkey to Crete to the Alps to the British Isles to Peru. The earliest dig there is 13,000 BCE. Between Musa and Dawood was the peopling of the Americas by the Olmecs, a mix of Africans and Chinese, and their spread from Central America and the collapse of the Bronze Age. Slide 2 begins with the Big Bang. Creation according to our Quran of 1400 years ago and the scientists of today. The scientists say the 4 forces that rule the universe started by being fused together. We say 3681, Allah said be, and it is. The scientists say the gases in the Big Bang became opaque. We say 4111, he directed himself to the heaven while it was smoke. The scientists say by 1 microsecond or so, the universe had cooled enough for protons and neutrons, and the universe expanded and cooled. We say 5147, and we are its expander. The scientists say 300 million years after the Big Bang, the first stars began shining. We say 37.6, we have indeed decked the lower heaven with beauty in the stars. The scientists say 3.8 billion years ago, life was woven by a primordial soup of the ocean. We say 2130, the heavens and the earth were a joined entity, and we separated them and made from water every living thing. This is a timeline I put together to show the gaps in their history books. They say the Neanderthals to Sumerians 3300 BCE with no explanation of how they came about. We say that there were 5 prophets before the Sumerians. Humankind began with Adam, and there's a wonderful story in Volume 1 filled with the facts around his creation. My timeline of the prophets begins around 30,000 to 15,000 BCE with the descension of Adam, and the earliest digs show human habitation around 14,000 BCE in Turkey, Iraq, Jordan. Adam could be a valuable resource for the challenges we feel today: fear, isolation, and belonging. He began humankind on earth. How fearful that must have been. The isolation of living in Jannah and then being sent down to earth. And as to belonging, we belong to him as his children, and he was given the knowledge of all he would need on earth. One of the most fascinating finds of the flood was that all the pre-flood pyramids found were underwater. 8,000 BCE in Rock Lake, Wisconsin in Japan. There is a Stonehenge-like structure dated 8,000 BCE right here in the bottom of Lake Michigan. There was an underwater city off the coast of India dated 7,000 BCE with pyramids in it. There were mounds dated 8,000 BCE also in Turkey, covering 34 acres, a mound with a paint workshop in it dated 6,000 BCE, and post-flood were the mound builders of America around the same time as Ad and Thamud, and there were hundreds of mounds built. The challenges Noah could help our youth with are peer pressure, hate attacks, and negativity. Peer pressure was giving dawah for 950 years with only 80 believers. He endured hate attacks as he built the ark in the desert, and negativity is that he had to make a dua. Ad and Thamud were from Sam, son of Noah, who went south to the Arabian Peninsula. This area was home to Kahtan, father of the Yemeni Arabs. The Hebrew word for Ad meant high and famous. Just to note that Thamud carved palaces out of rock, and the red she-camel of Allah was carved out of that same rock. In Volume 1, there's a very detailed history of the Semitic languages, from Adam to Isa and beyond. Historians trace 4 distinct periods of culture post-flood, which coincide nicely with our version of the repopulation of the earth by Sam, Ham, and Japheth. The tree that binds is an illustrative story of what it could mean to be the friend of Allah. The Nimrod dynasty was very likely sourced from the grandson of Ham, son of Noah. It lasted 1,000 years. Ibrahim was around 2000 BCE between the Old and Middle Kingdoms of Egypt. This was also the time of the completion of Stonehenge. Archaeological evidence of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah matches the Quranic description almost word for word. A new slant to the sacrifice of Ishmael is a historical fiction story as told by the ram looking down from Jannah. The line of prophets from Ishaq include 14 of the prophets in the Quran. The challenges to the Ummah that Ibrahim and his son Ishmael could help with are doubts, insecurities, a dual life, identity confusion, Islamophobia, and parents. Ibrahim stood up to his father and Nimrod to dispel all doubts. He was thrown into the fire and it became cool, which took care of his insecurity. And he was not only a prophet but the friend of Allah, which was his dual life. In identity confusion, Ismail was raised to recognize the truth. He knew that death was a win-win for Muslims, which made him strong against Islamophobia, and he respected and trusted his parents, even through the threat of sacrifice. Yaqub and his 4 wives birthed the 12 children of Israel. Yaqub, as a young man on his way out of town, lay down to take a nap and dreamt of what is called Jacob's ladder, where he saw the angels going up and down this ladder. He marked the rock he had laid his head on with oil and returned many years later to build a house of Allah on that spot. 1,000 years later, Suleiman built his masjid temple on the same spot. Yaqub was the same time as King Hammurabi and his code of laws, which were most likely prophetic remnants. A nod to how a shirt played a part in Yusuf's life. First the fake blood from the wolf, then the torn shirt during the seduction, and the shirt thrown over the face of Yaqub to cure his blindness. Yusuf had an amazing life, amazing beauty, amazing skills to do the work of the vizier of the famine. The challenges these two could answer are despair, hopelessness, depression, the pull of the society, tribulations, and slander. Yaqub was sent from his family at a young age, and he forgave this. He didn't see Yusuf for 40 years and had sweet patience. He fathered 12 children, thus staving off hopelessness. Yusuf answered the tribulation of being thrown down a well with forgiveness. A woman seduced him and then slandered him and sent him to prison, and he was patient. And he was a Muslim vizier in a society that worshipped idols, and that is a strong pull. In Volume 1, the first part of the story of Musa is told by the burning bush. Interesting perspective. He and his brother were in the new kingdom of Egypt. A fascinating fact is that the plagues only happened to the Egyptians, not to Beni Israel. The preserved mummy of the pharaoh was cause for the conversion of a Frenchman, Dr. Maurice Bucaille. He was asked to examine the mummy and came to the conclusion that this person was drowned, pulled out of the water, and hastily mummified. The Muslims around him confirmed that they already knew this from the Quran. He converted shortly afterwards. Simple lessons from Musa are: obey commands without question or things may get more difficult, such as the story of the heifer, and the beautiful explanation of evil in the story of Khidr. We don't know the whole story. The Olmec head on this slide means that it was being carved at the same time as Musa was confronting the Pharaoh, beginning the true story of the peopling of the Americas by the Africans and Chinese. The challenges answered by this prophet are a hostile government, hate crimes, and racism. Pharaoh killed the men and saved the women of Beni Israel, and this was racism. Musa spoke gently to this tyrant about Allah, thus handling beautifully a hostile government. And with the sea in front and the army behind him, he trusted in Allah, thus stopping a hate crime in its tracks. The Ark of the Covenant was lost to Beni Israel due to their weakness and disobedience. It was gifted back to Talut so they would accept him as their king. When he led them to Jalut and his troops in Jerusalem, 80,000 marched with him, but most of them drank the water and it dropped to 4,000. And then when these saw Jalut, only 300 remained. Daud stepped forward and killed him and became king. The Zabur was 150 chapters, and Daud recited it with the mountains and the birds. Subhanallah. He only ate from his own labor, and when the angel of death came to him, this king prophet said, "I am ready." Suleiman had power over the jinn, the wind, and had an army of beasts and birds and those jinn. He was unstoppable. Archaeologists found Sabian tablets describing a queen from Yemen who traveled north to Jerusalem. They confirm that she took camels there and returned by ships. This time coincides with the Adena culture of the American Northwest. These were the mound builders of America. The history of copper in the Upper Peninsula is a must-read. It quite probably fueled the Bronze Age and had trenches on the Isle Royale that were dated 10,000 BCE. The challenges to the Ummah today that Suleiman could answer would be wars, the unseen, and Islamic governance. The wars he fought were in Allah's sake, and they were just. He had power over the jinn, which was the unseen, and his father and he ruled with an Islamic government. Volume 1 ends with a history of Assyria from 3000 BCE to Yunus's time at 800 BCE. At the time of Yunus, there were images of genies or the jinn guarding the city gates of Nineveh. There was a king of Assyria, Ashur-dan III, around Yunus's time, who was rebellious against the idol worship. Could this have been the king who repented with Yunus's people? From the stomach of the whale, we were gifted the most piercing of du'as. The history of polo states that the first public match was 600 BCE. The timeline between Yunus and Isa is useful for tracing the Roman Empire. The story of Isa is told with the wise man giving a talk to a group of Christians in a huge cathedral, and this is useful for the Ummah to see a comparison of where Islam and Christianity agree and where we hit bumps in the road.